world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back here on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Tuesday, November 4th, as you are listening to this. And I'm going to start out with some news that popped up on my feed right before I sat down to record. And that is the passing of former Vice President Dick Cheney. Now, thoughts and prayers go out to the Cheney family, despite what you may think of Dick Cheney himself. We can at least mourn the fact that he has passed. Now, a lot of liberal-leaning people do not like Dick Cheney. He was a war hawk. He famously helped push us into the Iraq conflict, claiming that definitively Saddam Hussein in Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that were never found in Iraq. But Dick Cheney did do some things the last several years to, I don't know if necessarily make up for some of the things he had done, but he came around, backed his daughter's reelection campaign after she was being primaried by Donald Trump, saying Donald Trump was the greatest threat to the American democracy in modern times, coming out. And in 2024, during the presidential campaign last year, he did endorse Kamala Harris, going against his own party. Dick Cheney leaves kind of a staggering legacy. You're either going to love him or you're going to hate him. But former Vice President Dick Cheney has passed at 84. I do not know what the state funeral is going to look like, if there will be one. I don't know what Donald Trump is going to do. The article I saw on it right before I decided to start recording this did not mention anything about any of that yet. I would assume at some point flags are going to be lowered to half staff, but we'll see if Donald Trump actually follows through with that, because remember, he was so upset about flags being lowered for 30 days with the passing of Jimmy Carter, because it was going to interfere with his inauguration, and because it wasn't about him. He didn't want them lowered. He wanted them raised back up. So we'll see what happens with that. So former Vice President Dick Cheney has passed at 84. Apparently it happened last night, and I'm not entirely sure of the causes. Okay, now let's get into what we have going on today and what we are dealing with, and that is day 35 of the government shutdown. It has now tied the record for longest government shutdown. It doesn't appear that there's going to be a resolution anytime soon. However, we are hearing there is a little bit of movement. Now, we are hearing that in the House there is a bipartisan committee working to try to come up with a bipartisan deal to fund the government till mid-January, end of January, something like that. Now, they need a new deal, in part because the CR that the House passed back in September would only fund the government till the 21st. That is 17 days from now. Even if they pass it today, that does not guarantee that they would have the government funded longer than the 21st. So they would be right back having to renegotiate. The other thing is, this could be something, and with it being bipartisan, that Democrats could potentially get behind, including Senate Democrats. And the things I have read said that they would have at least 2 or 3 years of Affordable Care Act subsidy extensions. And I didn't see anything on the Medicaid cuts, if those would be returned or not, if any of that would be extended. But it wouldn't surprise me if there was several years of delay before those cuts took effect, or at least a percentage of those cuts returned, in part because Republicans know how bad this is going to be for their states. They're trying to play it up and play it off that, well, Democrats want to give healthcare to undocumented illegal immigrants. And of course, as we've talked about numerous times, that is not the case. Um, Medicaid is not allowed to be used for undocumented illegal immigrants. And even if it was, you were talking about them getting access to health care, not free money. But that's one of the things Republicans like to spin, and they like to do is they like to make things about something different than what it is. But federal dollars are prohibited from going to non-U.S. citizens when it comes to Medicaid, with one exception, and that is thanks to a law passed by Ronald Reagan in the 80s. I don't remember which year in the 80s, but it was during the Reagan administration, somewhere between 81 and 89. And what is that? That is the law requiring emergency departments to treat anybody who walks in their doors, regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their immigration status or anything. And if they can't pay, and this goes to American citizens as well, that Medicaid reimburses the hospital after a period of time and making sure the hospital is not out that money. That is the only way any undocumented illegal immigrant gets any sort of payment or benefit from Medicaid. But Republicans would have you believe this is some horrible program that all undocumented immigrants are going to get free health care. And I've seen some Republican creators come out and say, well, here's an idea, Democrats. How about instead of giving free health care to undocumented immigrants, how about we do it for American citizens? And they almost walked right into the point that we could afford to do Medicaid for all, Medicare for all, whatever you want to call it, universal health care, that we could make it affordable and free for everybody. But see, they only walked into that point because it means they get to deny health care to somebody else, a group they don't like. So we will have to see if this bipartisan deal goes anywhere. Now, this was in the House. However, this is going around Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who is still refusing to call the House back into session. It sounds like they are going to be out until at least next week. So, House of Representatives not in session. They are still held out. This is the longest recess I think they have had this year. They are going on 6 or 7 weeks of being out, not working, still getting paid, not doing anything. And one of the things Mike Johnson is able to avoid by not bringing the House back into session is the swearing in of Representative Grijalva. We'll get into that in a minute. But Mike Johnson's not bringing the House back right now. Why? Because he thinks he is winning and somehow putting pressure on Democrats in order to get them to come to the negotiating table and cave and give in and end the government shutdown. He keeps saying, well, you vote to open the government, and then we'll have discussions. Then we can talk about your priorities. Here's the problem. Why would Democrats trust Republicans at this point? Why would they? Back in March, they were up against a funding deadline, much like they were in September. And Democrats backed a clean CR, a clean funding bill, that would have funded the government till the end of September. Well, Democrats said, okay, we'll vote with you for this time, but we need some guarantees from you. And what did the Republicans guarantee Democrats? Well, that they would discuss and hold votes and make progress on extending the Affordable Care Act subsidies. And Democrats caved at the time, and there were people that were pissed at Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries for not doing what they're doing now and holding out and making the Republicans suffer. Well, they said, okay, you're promising to talk about Affordable Care Act subsidies later. We will keep the government funded. And in the meantime, not only did they never hold any discussions about Affordable Care Act subsidies, the Republicans also passed the One Big Beautiful Bill and a rescissions package. The One Big Beautiful Bill had cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, food stamp benefits, added in work requirements to those programs, and there were already some work requirements, but they extended those, had them apply to other groups of people that had been exempt before. Um, and it was mostly about cruelty. And for the most part, people on those benefits are receiving or they are working. They are not just receiving the free money. But see, Republicans like to spin the narrative. They like to make it seem like certain things are happening that aren't really happening. Now, when it comes to food stamp benefits and things like that, there are already work requirements, or there were. They just extended it. One of the things that they changed with the one big beautiful bill when it came to food stamps and work requirements was uh, parents with children. Now, if you were a single parent with children at home, the old rule was as long as any of the children were under 18, you did not have to work if you were receiving food stamp benefits, uh, because part of your responsibility was going to be uh, taking care of those children. Well, they lowered that age down to 14 and said, well, now when your youngest child is 14, you must work a certain number of hours. I think it's like 20 or something like that a week. Um, I don't remember the exact number, which isn't still a lot. And a lot of parents were already doing that. But Republicans don't care. Again, they spin the narrative to make it seem like they're doing something and they're saving a whole ton of money by forcing these people back to work. One of the other things is when it comes to the food stamp program or Medicaid or any other sort of government assistance, if you cross the earnings threshold, you do not get any benefits. And that has been a thing for a long time. I used to work with several people who were on government assistance. And we had several different ways that those employees would handle it. Now, one of the ways they would do that, um, we had the one guy who handled it very, very well and said, hey, look, I know next month, like 6 weeks from now, I've got a review coming up. Um, I've been looking over how much I'm making right now. I'm going to be over the income guidelines, and if I go over, they're taking my food stamps. But the amount I'm going to be over is not equivalent to how much I am getting in assistance, so I need to lower my hours for a few weeks, and he would work a little less. Now, I can already hear the Republicans saying that that's such a horrible idea that they should just work more. But what we're talking about here is somebody who he was a married person, no kids, but two people living on his income. He got, I believe, rent assistance. He got um, food stamp assistance, and they got something else too. But by cutting back his hours, he saved himself because he got those benefits. It was several $100s a month. But when he looked at his wages, he was only going to be over by like $50 a month. So, no, working a little, and he could not make enough hours at the place we were working as a part-time employee because they would not bring him up to 40 because they did not want to give him insurance. He didn't make enough money to qualify or to live without those added assistances. Now, could he have gotten maybe a different job? Maybe, and I think, and ultimately he ended up leaving to go work somewhere else, get paid better money. But when you're going through it, in that as you're trying to survive, staring at, well, do I make $50 more in wages, or do I lose all my benefits? And you know, he had to weigh that decision. So he would say, cut my hours back. But we had somebody else at the same time, similar problem, but married person, multiple kids, was receiving a considerable amount of assistance. But the same problem was only going to be over by less than $100, but was going to lose several $100s, multiple hundreds in benefits between rent assistance, medical insurance, um, food assistance, all of it. The amount of money extra he could make, and he had limited job opportunities. getting necessarily a better job wasn't in his future. Um, so he would, instead of doing the same thing the other guy did, said, "Hey, just schedule me a little less." He would just realize it was coming up, and he'd start calling off shifts and just missing work. The same result, but different outcome. Got the same outcome, but different ways of handling it. One way screwed over the business. Um, Thing is, when you're in that situation, and from my years of working with people who were in those kind of situations, and those are only two examples. I could probably list several more and do an hour podcast just on that. Um, when they're making those tough decisions, they have to realize and accept, they have certain limitations. So work requirements aren't always the answer, especially when it is you go over that limit, you lose everything you had built up. And if you have daycare assistants, right, like right now with daycare being so expensive, you go over that and you lose any daycare assistants you might have had, well, then you're not making any money because you can't go to work and you're right back where you started. So unless you get a significant bump up in wages, it doesn't work to just say, well, go work more. This is just a way for Republicans to be cruel and for them to convince people who are on assistance or that are in the lower income bracket, because a lot of Republican supporters are, not all, but a majority of them are of the lower income bracket. They are not billionaires. They are not millionaires by any means. But they are convincing them that another segment of their same demographic is the problem. That people that are slightly worse off than they are the problem and are draining resources. But see, they act like it is a pie, okay? And that by giving somebody else a piece of the pie, there's going to be no pie left for them. Here's the thing: all of those government programs that Republicans like to complain about people getting access to, you pay into those. You pay taxes for those programs. You pay in to Medicaid and Medicare. You pay in taxes for food stamps. So do I. And those programs should be there when we need them. The whole premise is we learned during the Great Depression when everything went sideways and there was no hope coming from the government. This was before all of the social safety net programs that we have now that we have taken for granted. When the Great Depression happened and the banks collapsed and no one had access to money, no one had access to food, people did desperate things. And they came out and said, okay, we need to fund programs to make sure people have access to at least basic food. Maybe not stellar food, but access to have something to eat, because people get desperate when there is no food. And then ultimately it came into healthcare too, that people should have access to at least go to the doctor when they're sick, or they shouldn't have to make these life altering decisions without healthcare, because they can't afford it. Because ultimately, we have a responsibility to protect and help our citizens. So we pay taxes into these programs to make sure that people are taken care of. But Republicans don't like that idea. They want everyone to suffer. They think everybody should have to pay their own way. And they want to get rid of anything that helps anybody. So, with this government shutdown, we are looking at what's going on. And like I said, we have this bipartisan agreement potentially coming out of the House. And if they agree to it, that would potentially extend the Affordable Care Act subsidies for a couple of years. Now, I have been saying if they were doing true negotiations, what Republicans would do after Democrats said, okay, we want them extended permanently, they would do something like this. I said, well, best we can do is 2 years. And Democrats would counter, and they'd go back and forth. Now, this 2 years may be the best that Democrats get out of it. But 2 years of Affordable Care Act subsidies kicks the can down the road to 2027 at the end of the year. What happens in 2027? Well, we've already had the midterms. And by that point, there could be a democratically controlled House and possibly a democratically controlled Senate, or vice versa. Maybe the Republicans keep the House, but the Democrats have the Senate. Now, why would Republicans agree to that? Because it seems to them that they would say, oh, well, we could be in the minority party by then and we won't get to do our cuts. Well, here's the thing. They think they're in a winning position here. They think they have the upper hand. They genuinely believe they are going to come out ahead on this deal and that they are going to come out with, extra seats picked up in the 2026 midterms, that they're going to have the House with a stronger majority, that they're going to keep the Senate and they're going to grow their majority. They believe it. Now, I think they're going to get blindsided, in part because of the cruelty put on by this administration. This administration had to be told by a judge that they absolutely must fund the SNAP benefit program with the emergency funds that are there. Now, those funds are only going to cover about half a month, a couple of weeks worth of benefits. Now, with the judge having said that they must do that, they've dragged their feet so far. Now, it sounds like that money may be released to states here by tomorrow, potentially, maybe by the end of the week. Well, that's delaying things for people to get access to their state level benefits. Now, some states do have the funds in their coffers to be able to cover the shortfall for a limited time, but other states do not. And the ones that don't are saying, well, you're not going to get anything out of us. We can't afford it, so we're not giving you anything. And until the government funds SNAP benefits. So we'll have to see. Those funds are going to be released. But people know we know when people go hungry, they turn out to vote. They get mad, and they're going to remember that. Now, people have a short-term memory when it comes to certain things in politics, but not being able to get access to food, even if it was for a limited amount of time, people are going to remember. And I think Republicans are going to be blindsided by how bad the midterms are going to be for them. And they're going to get a glimpse of how bad those midterms are going to be as of tonight. Now, polls are open across the country as you're listening to this. There's going to be city and county and local elections all going on. And every year that we have varying municipalities have their local elections. This is a recurring thing. And there could be elections for state house representatives, etc. So if you can get out to vote, I encourage you to go vote. Make sure you vote for your local representatives. But there are some statewide races that we are watching. Now you have the governor race in New Jersey and Virginia. You have the mayoral election for the city of New York, and we have Prop 50 in California. And I think depending on how these races go is going to really show how Republicans react. And maybe it's going to bring them to the negotiating table a lot faster. Maybe this bipartisan resolution actually goes somewhere and forces Mike Johnson to bring the House back into session. Why? Well, they're expecting close races in California, in New Jersey and Virginia for those governor races. They are expecting it to be very close, and I think they genuinely believe they have a chance at flipping New Jersey and keeping Virginia. And if they get blown out by like 65% of the vote going to the Democrats, they are going to be freaking out. They're not going to know what to do. Because it's not going to have gone the way they predicted. They think they have some kind of majority edge here, that they are going to be able to keep those seats of power. And when they lose them, it's going to catch them off guard. Okay, then you have the mayoral race in New York City. Now, there is no doubt in my mind that Mamdani wins that race. Just because the other two people running I can't think of the Republican's name, but apparently he was a known grifter and long time problem. So they were even hoping he would drop out. And then there's Cuomo, the failed former Democratic governor of the state of New York. He got kicked out with a sexual harassment scandal, I believe, and a bunch of stuff. Well, they think he's going to win. I don't think he's got a chance, but they are hoping, Republicans are, that he's going to pull enough votes away from Mamdani to make it a close race, or maybe he can somehow win. And I just don't see it happening. Now, they have done everything they can to paint Mamdani as some kind of an evil person. Donald Trump is talking about taking away federal monies from New York City, which he can't legally do, which courts have blocked him every time he has tried to do things like that. And he's tried to put pressure on the city of New York City to vote for either the Republican candidate, whose name I can't think of, or you have Cuomo. It's not going to work. I think Mamdani wins, and I think Republicans are going to be shocked by how much of the vote he actually gets, because he is talking about progressive ideas. He is talking about raising some taxes, local taxes in New York, but the benefit that would include extra help for low income housing, extra ways of making sure people have access to food, all of those things are going to be popular. And Republicans and establishment Democrats are worried about this race because it challenges the status quo. And it is going to set up potentially how the 2026 midterms look. What kind of people end up winning primary challenges in some of these states. Now, we have Prop 50 out in California, and that is the voter measure that would temporarily re-gerrymander California to add 5 Democratic seats. And Republicans are losing their minds. Why? Because Democrats dared to do the same thing they did. Donald Trump went to Texas and said, basically, get me 5 seats. So they redrew their maps, got rid of 5 democratically controlled seats by diluting their voting base, and instead of winning some of the seats where Republicans would normally win by 65% of the vote, by redrawing these districts, they are hoping that they can now pick up those 5 seats, and the previous seats and the new ones will all be Republican by 55% of the vote, instead of the Democrats winning 5. Now, this could backfire, as Republicans could potentially not turn up and vote in as strong. They may protest vote and vote for a Democrat because they're pissed that they lost their favorite representative, or that they didn't like the way this all happened. Or Democrats in those areas can look at it and go, hey, we may actually have a fighting chance here. And if their candidate overperforms, Republican efforts to gerrymander may go sideways when it does happen. But see, they did gerrymander Texas, and they've tried to gerrymander some other states to pick up a seat here and a seat there. Well, Gavin Newsom said, okay, you gerrymander Texas, we're going to gerrymander California. California being one of the biggest strongholds where they could turn around and do the same thing and take away as many seats as Texas just did. There's a problem. There's an independent commission, kind of like what Iowa has, that draws maps for California and tries to make it relatively fair based on voter dispersal and statewide voting patterns, etc., so that your number of representatives closely represents what the will of the people typically is. So in order to do the same thing Texas did, Gavin Newsom took it to the polls, and he is asking the voters, do you want me to do this? If it passes, then yes, they will be redrawn until we get to the next census in 2030. And then at that point, that is when they would be redrawn again after they do the census. Now, that is the problem with what Texas is doing. Typically, you do not redraw your maps mid-decade. You wait till after the census, you look at your new population dispersal and decide which states get extra districts, which ones lose districts. Um, you look at your voter pattern, your uh, race dispersal, your demographics, all of it. And then they redraw the maps, and some states do it with a bipartisan independent commission. Other states just have Congress, their state legislature pass a voting map. And typically, the only time mid-decade that they get redrawn is when a court has said your map is illegal, it's unconstitutional because of one of several factors. Usually, it's on race-based discrimination that you have instead of having your minority populations dispersed out evenly throughout the state where they could actually win multiple districts based on, like, if you have a state that has I don't know, 30% African American population or whatever, they should have the ability to maybe win 30% of the congressional districts, is what the courts kind of look at it. But a lot of times, what Republicans would try to do is gerrymander it so all 30% is in one district and only give them one area. And because usually the minority districts vote Democrat. Not always, but sometimes. Um, so, anyway, you have Prop 50 in California where they are going to be asking the voters, do you want us to redistrict? And if they do, this just offsets what Texas has done. And Republicans, I think, are expecting to lose that one. But they're trying to use it to set up some kind of a narrative going into 2026 about Democratic cheating. Now, we are waiting, though, also with this Prop 50. Nancy Pelosi has said that she will make a decision and she will make an announcement about her political career after Prop 50 passes or after the vote. Now, is she going to retire at the end of this term and maybe not seek re-election? We could hope. And this is not a knock on Nancy Pelosi. She has done great things in Congress, and she was a great Speaker of the House. However, her time is up. She's in her 80s. She needs to step down and let somebody younger run. This is the problem I have with aged politicians across the board. Both parties have problems with this. We need to let the younger people run, let them get in. Now, if this was something different, like what we had to deal with Joe Manchin in West Virginia, where like this is the only person who probably could win in a deep red area, and maybe they flipped a seat that should be Republican consistently, that's different. But we are talking about she is running for San Francisco. You're telling me that we couldn't find a single Democrat that could win in San Francisco? That makes no sense to me. So we'll have to see what her announcement is after this vote. Now, tomorrow when I do the podcast, I'll be recording it after hopefully we have some of the results in, if not a majority of the results in. So we'll know better how these races go. Now, I haven't really talked about the race in Virginia this podcast, but I think the Virginia governor race is going to go to a Democrat. Why? Because there's a lot of federal workers that work in D.C. but live in Virginia, and a lot of them are now furloughed. They're told, go home, we'll call you back when we need you. And Donald Trump has said, yeah, we don't know if we're going to pay you while you're furloughed. You're not doing anything, so why should we pay you? Because that's Donald Trump's MO. So with that being said, I think if they're furloughed and there's been no movement on this government shutdown, there's a chance that they go to the polls today and vote against the Republican because they're mad at how the Republicans are currently treating them. It's like I said, in some cases they're furloughed, said, yeah, we're not going to get you paid. Other ones are considered essential, are having to go to work and do their job, again with no guarantee of getting paid. And with it being Donald Trump, him saying, well, I don't know if we have to back pay those employees, even the ones that are showing up to work. That's who Donald Trump is. He doesn't think he needs to pay people, that they should just show up, do things for him, and, you know, he gets to take full advantage of them. And that's just not how that is supposed to go. So I think those federal workers that are living in Virginia but working in DC may vote against the Republicans to send them a message. Now we'll have to see how the Republicans respond to this message from the voters if this happens the way I think it should. That may bring them to the table and force them to start negotiating in earnest, maybe even reopen the House of Representatives. But see, Mike Johnson doesn't want to open the House of Representatives. Why? Because then he has to swear in Representative Grijalva. Now, he is trying desperately to claim that it has nothing to do with the Epstein files, and he is giving excuse after excuse for not swearing her in. She is currently the longest delay in swearing in a member of the House of Representatives after they have won their election. I think it's up to 6 weeks at this point, and growing by every day. He refuses to swear her in, saying they have to have the House in full session, but he says he won't bring the House back into session until they fund the government because they did their job and they passed a CR back in September. But like we talked about earlier, that CR's time limit is expiring anyway. They need to come back, and if they were serious, they would have been here negotiating the whole time, trying to come up with some kind of way to fund the government. But that's not what they're doing. They're bullying because Donald Trump doesn't want the House back in session. Why? Well, with Representative Grijalva, she would be the 218th vote on the discharge petition to force a vote on releasing the Epstein files. Now, Mike Johnson says those things aren't related, that it is that everything Epstein related has already been released to the public, except we know that's not true from the work their own committee is doing, saying, yeah, we're still getting more and more information. And there have been things that committee has let out to the public that Republicans get mad at when Democrats leak it out there that we hadn't seen before. So we know if they have to release the entirety of the Epstein files, there's going to be things we hadn't seen, and we are going to find out more about who was there, who was involved, etc. So Mike Johnson doesn't want to hold this vote. Well, he can't stop it once she signs the discharge petition. It forces them within a number of days. I don't remember the exact number, but it will be put on the docket. It will be scheduled. And then there will be a vote on whether or not to release the Epstein files. And Mike Johnson doesn't want that because Donald Trump doesn't want that. He doesn't want the Epstein files released because that would be bad for him. And because he's probably in the Epstein files. And I say probably because, well, in this country, you are supposed to have a presumption of innocence until you are proven guilty in a court of law. However, the way he is acting is not the way somebody who has absolutely nothing to hide and who is not in the Epstein files would act. He is trying to do anything and everything he can do to prevent those files from being released. He's trying to say, oh, there's nothing to see here. Are we still talking about that guy? He called up Mike Johnson, said basically, don't bring it to the floor. He had said anybody who votes in favor of the discharge petition or votes to release the Epstein files is hostile to this administration. So Mike Johnson is desperate to not hold a vote on the Epstein files. And with that going on, he's just continuing to keep the House of Representatives out of session and not swear in Representative Grijalva because it would force a vote. Now, when they do bring the House back into session, one of the things that could happen is because that discharge petition is going to be brought up and they can't stop the vote, and even Mike Johnson said they can't stop it, they could vote to vacate the chair, vacate the speakership. It would only take, I think, 5, 7, something like that, Republicans to agree to get rid of Mike Johnson with all Democrats. And if they do that, um, House of Representatives can't do anything until they find a Speaker of the House. Now, if that's actually what happens and the government is still shut down, then it's going to be a while before the government opens and before anything else happens. And Donald Trump would probably be okay with that. Why? Because he doesn't want to have the oversight there. He thinks as long as the government's shut down, he can do whatever he wants. The committees he was supposed to talk to about the renovations to the White House and tearing down the East Wing and everything are currently furloughed. They're not meeting because of the government shutdown. So he went, well, I don't need any approval. I'm just going to do it myself. And he reacted to people having the No Kings protest and them hurting his little feelings by tearing down the East Wing. He doesn't want to have to deal with any of that. And he thinks as long as the government is shut down, he gets to just do whatever he wants. And that's not the case. Now, today, there is going to be oral arguments before the Supreme Court. And by the time you listen to this, those oral arguments may have already happened. And this is on Donald Trump and his tariff case. Now, they are going to the Supreme Court trying to figure out whether or not Donald Trump has the legal authority to use and implement tariffs. Now, according to the way the Constitution reads, Congress has the power to impose duties, which are taxes, tariffs, fees, things like that. The law Donald Trump is pointing to that gives him, or he claims gives him the authority to put tariffs on in the cases of national emergencies, doesn't mention the word tariff once, nor any of its synonyms. And that's what lower courts have held, is Donald Trump does not have the power to actually do this, and that would make all of his tariffs unconstitutional. Now, Donald Trump, for his part, is warning about grave economic impacts, and we're going to have a depression the likes of 1929, and the stock market crash if he's not allowed to use his tariffs. Problem is, they're not doing the effects that he thinks because he doesn't understand how the tariffs work. He genuinely believes, because this is how he basically describes them, is if he puts a 50% tariff on, say, China, that China pays the tariff, and that money goes from the Chinese treasury to the American treasury, and it is just free money. Well, that is not how that works. How it does work is if you have a $10 item and you have a company like Walmart, they bring it in at the port, and that $10 item is now $15. That added 5 is your 50% tariff, using that as our base. The Walmart would pay the $5. That money would go to the U.S. Treasury. And then that item is now, instead of being maybe 12 at Walmart, it's 17 to 20 because it costs them more money. They have to raise prices to offset the tariffs. So we pay the tariff. But Donald Trump doesn't understand that, and he constantly gets it wrong. And I don't know if anybody can get it through to him, or if he does know, and he just thinks Americans are dumb enough to believe the way he describes it. Now, with these tariffs, he is also saying that we've raised trillions and trillions of dollars, which also isn't true. Most estimates are only saying several hundred billion, which seems like a lot of money. But when you remember that money is coming from Americans, that we are paying it when we go to the store, and instead of getting as much stuff, we're having trouble buying as much as we used to with the same amount of money because wages aren't going up fast enough to meet the rising costs due to these tariffs. It's hurting the economy. And then we hear, we don't have the official numbers because government is shut down and Donald Trump doesn't want to release the real numbers. But every time we get glimpses of what the economic numbers look like and what like the jobs numbers look like, it looks like Donald Trump is actively losing jobs in the U.S. economy. So with all that being said, with the Supreme Court looking at this case, they are going to try to see if Donald Trump does have the legal authority. Now, I think there's a good chance the Supreme Court upholds the lower court's ruling. Why? Because of how they phrased it in that ruling. Because they looked at the letter of the text that was written for that law, and because the fact of that the word tariff nor any of its synonyms apply or are in that text of that law, and that is what they are using as their justification to say Donald Trump doesn't have. That's what the court is using as its justification to say Donald Trump doesn't have the authority for the tariffs. But it's the same law that the administration is saying that Donald Trump does have the authority for the tariffs. So I just think this Supreme Court is going to side against Donald Trump in this case. And when it comes to cases like this, between whose power is it? Is it Congress? Is it the president? The text of the Constitution is pretty clear that Congress has the power to impose taxes or duties. And then you have the fact that Congress itself, at least half of Congress, has passed something indicating they do not consent to give Donald Trump the tariff power. We had 3 times last week the Republican-controlled Senate voted against Donald Trump to pass 3 separate resolutions that the House has yet to take up that would roll back Donald Trump's tariffs and saying, no, we are ending the economic emergencies, the economic declarations that you are using to put these tariffs in place. Now, the House would still have to take it up and Donald Trump would have to sign it, which is never going to happen. But it wasn't about actively passing anything. This was about putting something on record about what Congress, or at least part of Congress, thought about Donald Trump and his tariffs. And that is the thing. The Supreme Court is going to look at that when they try to rule on this case. And then you have the fact that Donald Trump himself came out after I think it was the Premier of Ontario, but I could be wrong. It was a premier of one of the Canadian provinces anyway, was playing this ad that was a clip of Ronald Reagan talking about tariffs and how it's a bad idea to use them as a shotgun approach and go against everybody like Donald Trump did, and basically saying anybody who does that is an idiot. And it was a legit quote from Reagan. Well, Donald Trump got his feelings hurt, came out, put a post up on Truth Social saying that, because they did this, we're putting a 50% tariff on them and we're stopping trade negotiations. Well, that could be admissible to the Supreme Court because that runs counter to what Donald Trump has been trying to say for so long, and that is that there is some kind of a national emergency that requires these tariffs in order to combat it. So we'll have to see how the Supreme Court rules on this case. Now, Donald Trump had talked about going to the Supreme Court to rule or to potentially talk or just to be there for oral arguments. Now, no U.S. president had ever been to the Supreme Court for oral arguments in a case. And this would have been bucking tradition. Now, Donald Trump does not give 2 shits about any sort of tradition. He just thinks he's a great orator and that he has all of the answers and that he can maybe direct the Supreme Court on how to act. Now, he also believes that because he put 2 of the Supreme Court justices on the bench, or 3 Supreme Court justices on the bench, that they owe him and they should be beholden to him. So he thinks maybe if he shows up and mean mugs them and glares at them a little bit, that they would side with him. Well, they turned around and they never actually said he couldn't go. But now Donald Trump is not going. Now his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is going. And that is also unusual the way I understand it. Typically, it is only attorneys that go before the Supreme Court. And I don't know if he is going to be there just in the gallery or if he is going to be there as part of actual, like, the defense team for the government. But that would also be unusual because typically it is only attorneys that argue before the Supreme Court. But again, Donald Trump thinks that he can just strong arm and get his way with the Supreme Court, and they're going to probably tell him not in this case. that no, he doesn't have that tariff authority. Now, they're claiming they have a backup plan and a different law that they can point to about how to get these tariffs still in place, even if this gets overturned. But I think once the Supreme Court rules on this case, if they side against Donald Trump, it is going to be a lot harder to, depending on what they do, to get those tariffs back in place. The biggest way they could get them enforced would be to pass it through Congress. However, the Senate has already said we don't agree with you putting tariffs on everybody, and they have voted to reject all of Donald Trump's tariff plans, which would undercut a lot of his negotiations on these trade deals. But these trade deals really haven't matured into anything. We hear from Donald Trump all the time that, oh, he's got to deal with China. I think we've heard 4 or 5 times that he's had to deal with China. And that still hasn't turned into anything. He said he had an investment coming for billions of dollars from Toyota. Toyota said, wait a minute, that's not what we said. And it just goes on and on. And now if these tariffs are off the table, that means Donald Trump won't have that bargaining chip to get his way when it comes to negotiating with other countries. He just thinks he can push foreign countries around and say, well, we're going to put all these ridiculous tariffs on you and we're going to do this. What he doesn't realize is that by putting a tariff on goods coming from a foreign country, it doesn't really hurt that country. It hurts the American consumer because we pay the tariff. Now, the only way it hurts the foreign country is if it actually affects how much we buy. Problem is, in the case of some of these things, we don't have a choice but to buy from the foreign country. For example, rare earth minerals, 90% of the processing worldwide for rare earth minerals that are used in computer chips, which the Biden administration was trying to get passed here. So with these rare earth minerals, 90% of them come from China. Now, Joe Biden was trying to put, with the CHIPS Act, he was trying to get we could make computer chips here and we wouldn't have to import them from China. So with the CHIPS Act, Joe Biden was trying to get it to where we manufactured computer chips here, but we need the rare earth minerals to do that. So when it comes to tariffs, if he's putting tariffs on China and we can't get the rare earth minerals anywhere else because 90% of the refining capacity comes from China anyway, all the tariff does is cause those prices to go up. Same thing with coffee. We don't grow enough coffee here. There is the Kona blend, I believe, that is grown in Hawaii. But just the Starbucks chain, the way I understand it, would use through an entire year's worth of growing from Hawaii in less than 3 months. And that's not counting everywhere else that has coffee. But Donald Trump puts tariffs on places that grow coffee and on coffee itself, and coffee is going to go up. It just happens. Same with bananas. We don't grow them here. So him using these tariffs as a bargaining strategy only hurts Americans, and I think these other countries realize that. Some of the frameworks of these deals that we were hearing, for example, when he was talking about them, I believe, if I remember right, the Japanese deal that he supposedly had, which never got finalized, was going to have 0% tariffs on U.S. goods imported to Japan or exported to Japan from the United States, and 15% tariffs on imports from Japan to here, which means everything that comes over, which includes a lot of electronics and a lot of technology, would be 15% more expensive. But see, American businessmen and American business interests would get 0% tariffs going into Japan, which means they can sell a lot more over there and make a lot more money. And American consumers eat the brunt of it. The deal was not great. It was not ideal for either side. The best kind of a deal is the type of deal which Donald Trump is now saying is the worst deal he's ever seen. He doesn't know who would negotiate that. That being the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is the agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, in which we've agreed not to put tariffs on each other, and we just move product around freely between the three countries, which is basically just a renegotiated version of NAFTA. And with that going on, now Donald Trump is saying that's the worst type of a deal you could possibly get. Yet it worked for well over 20 years until Donald Trump got involved with it. So it worked for over 20 years till Donald Trump gets involved, and he changes NAFTA in his first term, renegotiates it back to effectively to NAFTA with some very small tweaks, and calls it the best deal ever then. Now he says it's a horrible deal. And he thinks we have to have tariffs on Mexico and Canada, etc., and do all of this. Well, in part because he doesn't understand foreign trade. And I'm not saying I am a foreign trade expert, but one of the things he is pointing at and saying it's such a national emergency and it is so horrible and it's an imbalance is for some of these countries, we end up buying more from them than they buy from us. But for example, Canada, okay? He looks at Canada and says, well, we buy more from them than they buy from us. Canada has a population as a whole. It's bigger than California, but it is not anywhere near as big as the entirety of the United States. Okay? So just the number of people that are there is not the same as what is here. So of course, because we have the greater population, there's a bigger demand for things bought from Canada in the United States because there's more of us to buy it from. And then, which all that would mean is if we did trade them the exact same dollar amount, that would mean every Canadian citizen would have to buy that much more American product. It doesn't work that way. You need to look at per capita spending and everything else. He just doesn't understand. He thinks he's doing something. He's actively wrecking the economy, and he is going to go down as the worst president in American history. Now, they don't have a good contender for 2028 to run for the Republicans. Now, you're going to start seeing some movement, potentially trying to set up things for the 2028 presidential campaign. People like Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, they may be the two front runners. I'm hearing some other names like Tucker Carlson, Kristi Noem, other people like that. And while those people may end up being out there, I think it wouldn't surprise me if J.D. Vance ends up being the nominee. But I don't think it matters. They're going to be connected to Donald Trump. The fact that he is wrecking the economy on a consistent basis is still going to be going on. And it's not, I don't think the Republicans have any chance in 2028. Any serious Republican would not run until 2032 when they can run again, where they would be compared to a current sitting Democratic presidential term. At least that's how I think it's going to play out. So keep an eye out for people starting to talk about 28. You're going to start seeing people talking about primaries for 2026 and the midterms. Now that today is election day for 2025, now that we will get past that, we'll be looking forward. The results of today I will talk about tomorrow on the podcast, and hopefully that will lead us in the next few days to having some kind of a breakthrough and some kind of negotiations going on to end this government shutdown. But that's everything I got for you today. I want to take the chance and thank you for listening with me as I go on about everything going on here. I'll be back tomorrow to talk about even more stuff going on, hopefully with some news about how those elections went and maybe some news about how the oral arguments went over the Donald Trump tariff case. Like I said, I'm not expecting the Supreme Court to side with Donald Trump, but we'll see what that brings tomorrow. Thank you for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with more.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.